Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the final um, uh, presentation of the Emily Hall Tremaine Fellowship for Curators in Journalism. So, Brian Johnson is our final candidate and final curator. Welcome, Brian.
Hello, hello.
And I'm just going to introduce you a little bit. First of all, acknowledging here, Hyperallergic, where I'm talking from in Brooklyn, is the historical homelands of the Lenape, the Shinnecock, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. So, with that being said, I want to introduce Brian a little bit. He's a partner, creative director at the design studio Polymode. He's a member of the Monacan Indian Nation and holds a BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. He's a co-founder of the educational platform BIPOC Design History, and he's hyperallergic to cats. So good to know. Welcome, Brian. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad that we could do this finally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you've really been sort of diving into the Indigenous design history. So I just wanted to sort of start by asking, and you talk about this a little bit in your articles, which I'll post here for those who are interested to learn more. And I just want to mention we'll be discussing the exhibition as well in detail. So that's something that I hope you'll all pull up, and I'll just put it here for everyone to see. Um, but why don't you tell us a little bit about where the challenges were? I mean, looking at Indigenous design, it feels like there are challenges. You mentioned one of the pieces you grew up in DC. So the Smithsonian was a resource for you, fortunately, at least in terms of an archive. But what was that experience like? And what do you think are the real challenges for doing Native design histories?
I think what's really challenging is that first and foremost, there is no one homogenous or non-homogenous voice of indigeneity, right? There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tribes. There are tribes that have been eradicated. There are tribes that are coming together. There are clans. There are people that consider themselves to be indigenous, but they don't have a tribal background. It gets sticky and complicated almost instantaneously. So from the initial onset, you can say, well, how do I see myself or do I see indigeneity in popular culture writ large? And you can say, all right, I see it in everything from advertising, from Fords to football, butter to baseball, beer, right? Like I love alliteration that way, but it makes sense, right? You're seeing these wonderful ways that it's shown to me about how things should be. And so then how do you also then filter out and glean through all those posters, those informations to say, all right, was this actually made by an indigenous person? And then what is their audience? Is it an indigenous person speaking about indigenous language, about indigenous life, about indigenous culture to other indigenous people, or is it trying to educate them? So there's a big sort of like funnel that I would try to like put all this through because where do you get started? Like it's kind
Right.
of insane. And how would you then like really filter through all that? And so that's just how I got started.
Yeah, and I in your first article, which people should check out, designing a history of Indigenous graphic artists. One of the things I like that you did was you started with that scene in Reservation Dogs, right? And I mean, I read it as sort of just even like being excited to sort of have your sort of built and material history, being presented in a certain way. But how would you describe that? And you're not the first person who mentioned Reservation Dogs to me, because I think there's such a cult following around this in terms of like people really hungry for representation and stories from their communities. And there seems to be a real interest in this show in particular.
Where to get started with that? Okay, so it's nice when you're watching a television show, you feel comfortable, like you understand the vernacular, the jokes, the humor. It's not necessarily insular in what it's talking about, but everyone can kind of pick up on it. I had been doing research for months on just finding posters, going to powwows, being online, being in the libraries, sneezing my brain out because of the dust, like all of those sort of things. And when you're watching a television show, and you get to a scene where you're in Bear's bedroom, I did truly scream and had to pause like the shot because there are two posters in the background that I knew who the individuals that made them were. And I was like, so I'm not the only one that's seeing this. I'm not the only one that's finding these posters, that's talking to these artists, that's buying these works, because it ended up going through all of the production of that entire team, of putting them on Bear's wall, of showing what that actual reality was. And so I at least felt that I was on the right path while doing that. And I also feel like, to answer your point about like why everyone's saying you should watch this, sure, there's only 12 stories. Like, we understand they have to be retold, but when they're told from a very real place and the storytellers are telling it from vulnerability, this is what we're going through, and then using really good humor and using irony and using like myth and legend that also melds within that culture itself, it actually sings a little bit louder, right? Because everyone's just like, oh, I understand what that's like. No, I do not live in Oklahoma. No, I don't understand what it's like to live on that sort of land and reservation. But I get the ethos of being a teenager, of having to go through all those things. I understand what it means to have my family and my ancestors around me. And then to, you wake up one day and there's a crazy spirit throwing fry bread at you. Like, no, that has personally not happened to me. But you want those things to happen, right? The idea of the supernatural is something where, yeah, we would like that in our waking daily lives, right?
And what a powerful metaphor too for many things. And I think that's one of the things I think the show really sort of speaks to a lot of people in many ways. So now tell me a little bit about why you chose to start with the graphics there. And what was it about that kind of the way it was sort of organized, the images they used? And what do you think Reservation Dogs does really well about this kind of material history?
I started there because that's, to me, working with BIPOC design history, uplifting marginalized voices, I have learned so much from the other scholars, individuals, and people that have trod this path with me. I am not alone. I am not the solo egotistical sort of like artist splashing paint onto a canvas. So I have also been really well educated to say you should take a look at who is the most harmed, and you should like write or think about what they are needing or seeing or feeling. And so to me, a really good hook is to say a large access to something is something like the show Reservation Dogs. And so if everyone is watching TV, we all get those ways. We all want to sit and have our shows and go through it all. That's at least a way to go in and say, we've all been a teenager. We've all put stuff on our walls. Like, in the interviews that I have with the other sort of designers that I've met to talk about like these posters and what they mean behind them, I ask them, what poster did you have on your walls when you were a kid? What did that
And
mean to you? And it was all over the board. It was like
really,
basketball.
okay.
It was basketball posters. Mine was maps, and so there were a lot of maps that people talked about, like truly understanding the land that you came from. Typologies, like how tall things were, different sort of like charts of like where like lakes and streams and pathways. So like, yeah, there are the basics that we would assume: movie posters,
Right.
bad sort of like always like the teeny bopper, like you have to have like the hot individual with like scantily clad clothing, all the good ones that
Right,
we
right,
don't want
right.
to remember, but we are completely, it happens. This is what we do. It's what we like.
Sure.
And like that's what came up out of those conversations, is that we all have gone through that. And so that's what Reservations Dog did well. They were like, so what are these? Like, you think about how I loved it because the medicine wheel was framed right below Bear's window, and that was the actual key point. I don't know if that was on purpose, but whoever like framed that shot, I was like, that was pure magic to me. The fact that the medicine wheel colors are on his blanket. These are little
Right.
things where, for anyone looking for message and metaphor that's just one or two like meta layers deeper, I was all about it. So like they really took the time and the consideration to tell a good story, when sometimes it's more about churn and burn, just it's a little more saccharine. And I don't think that's what it was like for Reservation Dogs.
Absolutely. So I just want to encourage people, if you have questions, we'll try to work them in as we're talking. So feel free to post them, or I'll just wait to the end or something. So I just want to encourage people so that we can just have sort of an easy conversation about this, because I think there's so much good material. So now, who would you consider some of the sort of the people who were best known first for creating these kinds of graphic identities, or perhaps different kinds of graphics? Because of course the American Indian movement had its own kind of graphics, and a different who do you attribute that sort of early consciousness of creating indigenous graphic design?
Okay, so now I'm going to start to pick a fight, I'm sure.
I love it. Okay.
There's a part of me that says outside of paper and a printing press,
Mhm.
wampum belts, so you have a piece of wampum, it's made into a
Yeah.
bead, and you actually show it into a large belt. Those belts told visual stories. They
Right.
showed metaphor. They were, they explained treaties. They're like, this is your representation, this is mine. And they would hold it up in public. They would wear it. Like, that is a physical documentation that says, this is my message. I'm going to repeat it. It is on repeat, like I've said too, right? So at least for me, would say from that level, okay, but then that can disseminate into baskets, that can go into blankets, that can go into rugs. Like, it becomes this is where, for an art historian, they're just like, well, but that could be craft. Well, that sort of starts to pick
Right.
another fight too, because visual language and visual media, a poster is a great thing. We're very sort of ensconced in that history from Industrial Revolution on. But if you
Right.
want to think that there are other things, like the wampum belt is like that to me is there are messages, they are traded, they're used as sign markers, but you can find visual language in clothing. You can find it in, bandolier bags. Like that level of sort of visual distinction to tell stories kind of goes over everything. So, I mean, that could go back even another 1,000 years to pottery, how you're, carving it into stone, how you're using that in mound building. I mean, it
Right.
gets really, again, it's complicated. It's not as cut and dry.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that makes sense because of the patterns, right? And the patterning and this sort of like language that comes out of that, which is, I guess, what people also look at when it comes to embroidery or carpets or these types of things. So it's like a different kind of knowledge. Now, how about in terms of printing press or printed or paper or any kind of ephemera?
The oldest piece of, I would say, printing that I know that was designed by an Indigenous person for indigeneity writ large would be sort of Sequoia and the invention of the Cherokee like language. I could be totally wrong, and that's why I'm also like other people can teach me
Right.
these things. But when I find broadsheets that have been made by Pendletons in Boston in the early 1800s that actually have the entire Cherokee alphabet put up on it, though he probably didn't typeset that whole thing, he did invent it. And so that invention of explaining it and how those broadsheets were made to then be distributed, which then turns into, let's say, the Cherokee Phoenix like newspaper. These things to me start to say there is a conversation where these are like posters. I mean, you could also say the Eliot or Algonquin Bible that was made at the Harvard Indian School, but that's a little picky, and that's indoctrination, that's trying to sort of like spread the Christian message. That comes with fangs and teeth, so you have to sort of like move away from that, right, to say what is the thing that indigenous people made for themselves to then support culture, language, and that's why I think it's probably around that time when I think that the printing press was able to be opened up in a broader sense around, I think, like the early 1800s.
Right. And then where in the history of this, I mean, and I just want to sort of be clear that these projects are all just research based, and I know that Brian is going to be finding more material, and we welcome people to send him hints of material because the whole point of this project is also to discover new things. And you did some original interviews along with this and discovered a lot of material. So everything's wonderful. We just want to sort of like continue the conversation and encourage people. So now when it kind of came to like anybody who really sort of pushed the whole field forward in terms of whether it's a creative person who perhaps a designer or a printing press somewhere, is there any other kind of pivotal moment you see as important to this history?
So this is why I'm sort of doing this. I feel like we need to know more. We need to dig through these archives. We need to find these pieces. Like when I say like, is there an Indigenous design like history handbook? Doesn't exist. It's not in Megs right now. Like there are no books about this, but you can find the reverse. You can find
Right,
the ones about like the Buffalo Bill posters
right,
and all of the extremely negative sort of aspects that are sort of like lit on to indigeneity. But when it comes to like who's actually doing that, this is the problem. Like, since there's no centralized sort of like conversation, it's based on a lot of erasure. It's based on pure racism. It's based on genocide. It's based on the forgetting aspect. It's just,
right.
cultures live and they die. That's what happens. And so, how do you then get into that habit of saying, well, what are these things? The one that I knew going into this was Aquasansi nodes. So, the Mohawk Nation, that is in and around sort of like New York and then going into Canada, that they actually had a newspaper called Aquasanti Notes. And so that is where I start to feel that from the movement of the American Indian movement forward, that's where you have greater access to lithography, screen printing. It becomes cheaper to do your own ruby lith, to pull like a screen, to then make something fast, to find a printer that's not going to charge you a lot of money to have 4-color or 2-color. So I feel like that's when it starts to pick up, is around the civil rights movement, is when you really have an influx of more makers, more people making posters, pamphlets, leaflets, broadsides, billboards, on and on and on from there.
Fantastic. Okay, should we get started into looking at the exhibition? Let's do that.
Let's do
We
it.
have a couple of questions, but we'll tackle those a little afterwards so that we can take a look at this. So let's see. So the exhibition is Can We Find Our Way to Indigenous Joy? So can you tell us a little bit about why you chose this title, and perhaps a little bit about how you conceived of this exhibition?
Absolutely. So I had the luck of being mentored and or working with Dr. Dory Tunstall. She wrote a book called Decolonizing Design, and Polymode actually designed the insides of the book, chose the typefaces, the layout, the sacred geometry, and then we teamed up in a greater collaboration with Sadie Redwing, who did the cover, and Anna Aggie, who did the illustrations. And Dory says, like verbatim, these are the ways that we must decolonize design. And the last point is, how can we also bring about and sort of celebrate Indigenous joy? And so how can you find all of these pieces where someone is making something for the pure love and radiation of joy to come off of it? And that's what it means to sort of, when I talk about how do these posters keep singing on repeat one, because we imprint them with a message, we put it up and it sits there and it sings that note over and over and over again. And so that to me was, how can we think about that joy? Because there's been so much negativity, racism, death, destruction. We really need to sort of like work that earth and sort of grow a happier community and deal with these things. And so since that was the fifth point, I also wanted to point out, yeah, there's a lot of hard things that we have to go through. So I want to sort of turn that a little bit, and I want to start with joy and then work our way back.
Great. Do you want to talk about this first image? Because you talked about New Red Order's project that happened last year, the World's Unfair. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what interested you in this kind of graphic project that they were engaged in?
Sure. So I did not know this was happening. And when I was working on a project with Aperture, the photo publications book, I was there working with one of the editors, and she's like, hey, I think you need to also like go down to Long Island City and see what the New Red Order is also doing. She's like, I think this is like in your avenue. You should go do this. And so I went down and I saw these posters, and I literally just started to take pictures of everything. And to have someone say, create Indigenous futures today, that sort of 1980s inspirational type of poster just like set my heart afire. And I really loved that. But I wanted to lean into, if this is making me excited, and you can see I'm getting excited now, it's like, this is how I wanted to start this. Like, there's this level of, it's real, it's grungy, it's up on a board, it's been pulled down. It's not this thing that is hermetically sealed in a plastic bag and it's never been folded. I'm like, there's something about the reality of life and like that messiness. And again, like, it's conflicting, it's a lot, it can be chaotic, it can be, really messy. And that's just kind of why I wanted to start with this. And also, I do want to create space for Indigenous futures, to have people say, there's no room at the table. The only people here are, everything from design came from the Bauhaus on, right? I don't agree with that. I think there is a multiplicity of voices, and they can all sit at the table, and we can make room for everyone, and everyone can research and talk and join into the conversation. But you really have to think about, like, we have to create these futures. Like, 2 months down the road, like 6 months down the road. And when I met with the New Red Order, that's what the collective was saying. They're like, all these people are like, I want to think about the world in 100 years. And it's honestly like, who can we feed tomorrow? Who needs to learn something tomorrow? Like, my 5-year-old is going to be 6 next year, not mine, but I'm just saying metaphorically. And that if that someone's going to turn 6, how do they see and learn these things, right? We need to think a little bit in the short term and also in the long term. And so to know that that's what the New Red Order was thinking, I have to also help make the space. I was given this, this moment with you. And so I want to make sure that I can also create space to have these other individuals sort of join in. And so that's what I started with.
I'm just moving to this sign so people can get a better sense. This was a creative time installation at the site. So, but you can see the posters a little bit more in situ right here, to kind of give a sense of the scale as well, I think, and for the fact that this is a very busy corner with a lot of subway. There's a subway station right there, MoMA PS1 a few blocks away. So there's certainly people walking by in that way. So, and then this rematriation services. And what do you think about the actual design of the posters? Like, what does that for you? What does that tell you, or what does it suggest to you you're looking at? You mentioned 1980s posters. What other kind of languages do you see here?
So in the conversation with New Red Order and with Riley, it was the whole conversation of it was going on. What do you see when someone's like, call this lawyer? Like, it's ironic, it's very tongue in cheek, but it's also, what do you see when you're riding the subway? Like, what do the advertisements look like? What's catching your eye? What is also zeitgeisty? What's like actually a little too cliche, but then it's also easy to understand. And so the whole concept, there's creating Indigenous futures, but it's also about like the first sort of, or one of the first points from Dory was you have to give the land back. Right. So you have to learn the land that you're on. So you have to sort of talk about it. And then you have to then say, okay, well, then how do you give it back? Because if this land was all taken from the Indigenous people, it was not just given away, then you have to say, well, some of these individuals, when they find out like, oh, my family had all this land, we inappropriately took it from Indigenous people, there are people that are actually asking, I want to give this back. So that's the thing about the New Red Order. It's ironic, but they're actually trying to help people understand how to give the land back. So it's not just humor and satire, it's also real. So when it comes to the real idea and looking at the design, I love that it's a clean message. You can actually read it, you can understand it, there's humor in it. It's looking at what the world is like consisting of right now. But then it's also like crimes against reality is another sort of like motif that was in the installation. There are also videos that are in there. There's illustrations going on. It's messy. It's dirty. It's complicated. It's really, really crazy and zany. This goes along with what I think is just how illustration is right now. Certain people, like, I love that it's of the now, and then it's also sort of walking away from that at the same time. You'll see that there's also the actor that's playing sort of like the skeezy, like, if you want to give it back now, call this number. Like, they're really pushing the
Has anyone
finger
done it?
on.
Do you know if anyone's done it?
Oh, you can call the number.
No,
like, it's a real
has
number.
anyone actually done it? Do you know if anyone's
Yes.
actually called? They have.
Yeah. And like people have also given land back too. Like, so that's the thing. When you were in the show, there's an area that has an entire video documentary that the team did that also shows how large institutions and small individuals have given land back. Like, right. It truly is like
I saw that, but I wasn't sure how much of it was fictionalized and wasn't. That was part of the thing for me because I wasn't actually 100% sure.
Call the number.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so now you also mentioned this poster, the Warren Montoya poster. Actually, there are a number of people involved in this.
There's three of them. Yeah, there are
three of them. So tell us a little bit about this, because I think one of the things that really spoke to you was the sort of the broader, the kind of openness of this poster.
I would love to. So the first thing about this one is like understand like physically the reality of where you are. So right now, when I sort of like introduce myself and I say, hi, I'm Brian Johnson, my pronouns are he, him, I will then follow it up with physically in this modern technological day and age, I need to say, I live and work in Raleigh, North Carolina. That is a place, it is a location, like, and in that space, I then say, it used to be like maintained and cared for by the Lumbee people, but that was taken away from them. So it's unceded land of the Lumbee people. And so that's what I would say. So like if I were to print this out in Raleigh in my office, it would say you're on Lumbee land. If I go home to my parents, I would say that I'm on sort of Monacan land. And like you said, when you talked about like, where Hyperallergic sits, you say that there were lots of people that went through these areas. And then what I also love about it is that if you just leave it blank, you're looking at Turtle Island. You're seeing the entire sort of formation of what that could be. And so you also don't have to answer it because the image behind it is also giving you all that you need at the same time.
Absolutely. And so now we'll scroll down, tired, sick and tired of living on stolen land, and then commit the crimes. And then you go into these posters, which I mean, I guess represent a whole different kind of, because we're going from something that feels more like made for a cultural community and maybe like an arts community, and now these seem to be posters that are made for a broader sort of general public. Am I right to characterize it that way?
You are. So like George L. Russell is literally making posters that are saying like, look at this map. These are the lands that are indigenous. These are where all of the reservations slash concentration camps are. It's showing, up top you see the what is now the United States in red, and then how the land is pushed away. So it's telling you and unpacking an extremely hard truth. On the lower right, you can see how it says what were sort of like indigenous sort of people and like what were their populations. You can see sort of like genocide, war, everything that's happened because of smallpox. You can see how the population gets extremely low and then how it then grows back. It's like if you actually read all the little paragraphs, I mean, it's telling you all the wars, the Trail of Tears, the removal of Indian lands. It is giving you an extremely hard, very violent, very unhappy history. And of course, revisionist history is what America loves to do a lot of the time. And so it's really deeply getting into where these sort of areas are and what has happened. And then what I love about it is that it also frames it in a beautiful like it's a re-indigenizing of like look at this nice sort of like ornament that goes around it to say you might think that you control all of this, but we're going to pull it back some more and really sort of reanalyze this because like this history is not taught. We just say, oh look, Columbus found it, we took it over, and we're just not going to get into like the really bloody, nasty detail of American history and also like Canadian history. And also like it's not just us, but like I have to say I'm thinking about it from a United States. This is the country that I'm in now. This is the government that I'm under. And so I analyze it from those times and I will make broad statements like this, but it's also Canada's having the same reckoning. New Zealand with the Maori is also having it. So like it's around, like these are things that are being talked about. And so to talk from land back, you have to also understand how the land is very, very pivotal because we should be taking care of Mother Earth. Like this is a thing that we live on. Like we should be really interacting more and like taking care of it. And we're not.
And there's a lot of information here. I'm very impressed with how much, I mean, it's practically a book. I mean, to fit into one image of the American Indian history map. And then the part that I like particularly is, and I think this speaks a little bit to what you've been saying with some of these different graphics, is the 2090 element at the top corner where it says Indian land question mark. And it sort of opens up a possibility of something else, right? And it's not just sort of projecting backwards or just even to the present. And that seems to me, am I correct to sort of say that that seems to be something that's very prominent in contemporary indigenous graphics or this kind of visual languages that are emerging, this kind of futurity or looking towards the future?
I think it is coming. Like I think there's enough voices, there's enough collective mass, like people are talking about it, are pointing it out. I feel that, the civil rights movement with when you have sort of like the Black Panther movement and the American Indian movement sort of happened and sort of took off at the same time. They were supporting each other, especially the Black Panther movement turning and influencing the American Indian movement. That it's sort of just gaining sort of traction because there's actually like enough people sort of like shouting and screaming and saying, pay attention. I do feel that because of technology, social media, the internet, the access to certain things also causes that sort of megaphone to turn up, but then it also causes a lot of cacophony and you have to sort of filter it through. So then to get into this piece, like this is an Aquasansi note. So that was a newspaper, but the newspaper also in the centerfold would have a large poster, but then you could also send in your $2 and you could get a poster. And so you're having here, always remember your fathers never sold this land. And so you have to remember that Mount Rushmore is also a sacred site to the Lakota, and that we just decided as the American United States government to then bomb it and make some nice, pretty faces of white presidents. So they're using this image to also say, maybe you should put in someone else that's also indigenous here. They're speaking an extremely hard truth. They're using a little bit of irony, but they're also giving it right back to you. Like they're not settling down. And so this is what Aquasanti Notes did, was like refixing that gaze using, the Western gaze of these photographs and then changing everything and then pushing it back forward, which I absolutely love because I am bitter and I love like humor like that. It's biting and it's like sardonic and it's just like, look at this, remember this, do not forget this, we are your ancestors. I love that remembrance. I love that sort of, that very upfront sort of arrowhead that's going to pierce you when you sort of read and look at this.
Absolutely. And I think I didn't quite know initially that the newspaper was sort of doing this. This is kind of like a beautiful kind of element of that. And it shows how it sort of was embraced by the community. And then I guess this is another one of the posters from the same publication. We decided that our Indian people are more important to us than long jail terms. This one is, yeah.
Because we remember the Battle of Wounded Knee, but it happened again, and there just happened that federal agents also got shot and killed there, and so like because of that, like indigenous people were also protesting, and then they were getting sent to jail, and they were also like the late '60s, early '70s was a wild time, as we all know, and like there was a lot of violence that came about, and they were just making really hard truths here. And so Aquasanti Notes did not back down from that. They're like, we're also going to support these individuals. So yeah, they are literally speaking the hard truths like Tori talked about.
Now, did they feel very supported doing this kind of work? I mean, at that era, I mean, were they afraid of different kinds of things, whether it's sort of funding or any of these kinds of questions that arise? Was there anything like that for them?
So these are the people that I haven't talked to yet, so I can't even answer
Gotcha.
that
No
question.
problem.
But I would
More
assume like
soon.
maybe it was hard. They're like this is the thing. I will openly say there are things that I don't know. And I still need to
Right.
learn because I need to pour into that more because if I'm engaged by it, like this is the thing I would love to say if people know, tell me what books to read, tell me what articles to find, who is also doing it, right? Like that's the kind of collaboration that we really, really sort of need.
Yep. Here's another one. Also, why should an Indian woman have to bleach her hair to be accepted? Ooh, this, I mean, talk about ahead of its time, too. I mean, just even the way it's sort of done, the imagery, this could easily be sort of a meme we see or some sort of meme that sort of appears now. So what was the visual language? What have you sort of discerned like that they were looking at? What were the different things? And were there any schools that were kind of real hubs of this kind of activity?
Well, see, this is the thing. I don't think there were really hubs. It's hard for me to say. Like when I have so many holes in sort of all the works that I'm finding, that's why I also feel like it's one of those like people's graphic design archive. It's like if we all start to pour all of this together, I actually might be able to say, can we draw like a line? But since there are so many voices and there's so many tribes and there's so many literal physical areas that might not be able to talk to each other, you also have to think super local, but then you have to think nationwide. And I feel like Aquasanti Notes did have a pretty nationwide sort of way of distribution, but I really don't know like where these schools were. There were trade schools that were, like let's say around like Santa Fe or in and around sort of like, the Mohawk territories or, around, California and San Francisco. There were groups of people and collectives that were doing silk screens and that were making these objects. But since I feel like it's so fractured and we don't really have through lines, that's what I'm kind of trying to start here is to say, if I can at least start some of these and get a timeline running, we might be able to find other enmeshments that can sort of like layer together to build a larger cohesive story.
Absolutely. And then this one by Indian Joe Morris, who's a member of the Blackfeet Nation, about Alcatraz. And of course, Alcatraz was such a pivotal point in that history where it was sort of like people celebrated it as this kind of occupation that sort of, got a lot of headlines, got a lot of attention, brought a lot of attention to the pressing issues of the time. Now, this seems to be, am I correct to assume that there's a number of Alcatraz related graphics?
There are.
Yeah.
So when the American Indian movement occupied Alcatraz, that was the whole point. They were saying, hi, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is horrible. The United States government is being horrible to indigenous people. We're going to take this land that you consider to be useless and you're not doing anything with, and we're going to occupy it. And it was a literal bellwether moment for the American Indian movement, and sort of like everything sort of exploded from there. And so I have found many posters that truly sort of start with this and then go from there. And so this is one of them where I just really love that it's a mix of illustration, but it also has like, clear typography. It's referencing like, solid sort of like class or serif letter forms, but then it has all the different tribes that are also sort of like embodying it and surrounding it and uplifting it and quote unquote speaking as one voice or coming together to speak as a voice. And then you have the individual raising the sacred pipe above the Golden Gate Bridge. So this is a very, and you can see that this actual poster was seen and replicated and sort of redone many ways because I've seen like always the buffalo coming across the top. Like I've seen small little teepees that will appear on the bottom where the top of the teepee then becomes an A, and so they're using iconography to also become letter form. So there are little things that have come out of this. And then in terms of call and response, in 2008 there was a lot of a revamping of other posters that are speaking back to say this has been 30 years later, let's talk about this. So it's been amazing to see that time frame.
So who was the audience for a poster like this? Like when an artist like Indian Joe Morris made this poster, what would be the life of that poster? Or what have you been finding? Because obviously each one I'm assuming is different, but what tends to be the life of the life cycle of these posters?
I want to say they're like hot and fast because like I'm finding some good work, but I'm also finding a lot of damaged work. Like I'm finding like Aquasansi note stuff on eBay, but they're really, really faded. They've sat out in the sun too long. Like they're water damaged. Like I really do think it
Maybe they were
was.
loved. Maybe they were
I
very
mean,
loved.
they could have been, yes. Like this is on my office wall, and I put it there, and I
Right.
saw it every day, and I thought of my ancestors. I don't want to doubt that either, but it's
Yeah.
it's hard to find really good condition, undamaged, like sort of works like this. And so a deeper part of me says it was supposed to be like for the now. It was very much take this, buy this, get this out, pass the message, support your people, keep this at home so when you're having a really bad dark day you can look back and say, oh,
Right.
but there are uplifting things. Again, the indigenous joy that comes out of hardship, that comes out of the act of making and creating and illustrating. And so I am sure that Indian Joe truly loved making every single part of this. I'm sure he also struggled and it was hard and he was like dealing with emotions, but at the same time the amount of light, that effervescence, like the buffalo sort of running towards the east and coming towards him, like there's so many uplifting like metaphor and motif here that how can you not feel good about this?
Right. Right. And now, of course, we're getting into some of the more familiar, maybe for some of the people watching this, some of the imagery around the Dakota Access Pipeline with the protests. Of course, the Water is Life poster, this one by Sadie Redwing. Now, there feels like there's a bit of a shift during this century in terms of the maybe the diversity of visual languages being used. But what have you found, and how would you characterize that shift if you see one at all?
I think there is a shift. I also think like a lot of the scholarship then starts to change. It's like when everything we know about the Indians is wrong, and you have to really say a lot of what some people, and that's the thing too, right? Some people will, I'm not speaking, I'm speaking for myself. And so like when you see like what does it mean to be indigenous, it's going to be very, very different. I don't have a lot of posters from the 90s. There seems to be like a dip in poster making as we leave the 70s and come into the 80s. And maybe that's just because American culture was so dominant that it sort of really rang true. Or maybe I just need to find more works, right? But then after we come out of the 80s into the 90s, and sort of there is a resurgence again of sort of coming into indigeneity, by the time we get to the Dakota Access Pipeline and Sadie's work here, it's a melding of both, right? You have what I think is the middle class of indigenous people actually have the ability to have access to computers, easier printers, and the ability to study and work on these and like make objects and like view indigeneity in a way that's not based on a looking back. It's looking
Right.
forward. It's looking and using modernity as another tool in our toolkit to then create what is the future rather than saying it always has to be buckskin and beads. That's not to say that that's not a good thing and cannot be sort of transposed and pulled with us. That's not what I'm saying, but it is sort of let's do something else and let's go back to visual language, especially when I know Sadie designed this so it could be used physically printed and on social media and on the internet, and it could be digitally sort of passed around. That was her understanding. So when you can make it quick and fast like that and use only, visual language and typography, it's quick, right? Like there's thought put into why they chose certain things like that.
Also, now that you said social media, the square format makes a little bit of more sense too, because the influence of the platforms certainly are gonna do that, and also it's just easy to read. And then this one by Crystal Worrell, I mean, I think this is like, it looks luscious. Like, meaning like just
I
the
wish
way
that gray box wasn't on it, because I have a cleaner version of that when we should change this image, because like it's actually hyper vibrant. Like it is
oh
almost
wow.
neon when you look at this. And that's what I really, really love about it, is that she is leaning into, or they're leaning into, what that sort of color is. They're using gradient to give this idea of like, there's a three-dimensionality to it, but it's also a slight reference back to the 90s and Saved by the Bell, but then it's also sort of like of the now. I love that. And
Yeah,
it's that level of like, yes, give me more of this. And like the letter forms are also hand drawn, but you can also tell that they're sort of like skewing and changing and redoing other digital type. Everything about this was just singing to me from the get-go. And it's also talking about like, save and protect our tribe, like stay home, like don't have COVID and go pass it to people that are more vulnerable. It's coming with very, very sort of strong messages. And you can see that in the actual form work of, holding of the hand, stay away, like be protecting of what's going on here. Like there are other dialogues that if you actually are like a Klingon, like you can be able to see and read these. I don't know all of them. I can assume some. I can learn more about it, but they're speaking to their people both in, sort of like Romanized letter form and also illustration as well, which I really
right,
loved about it.
without the traditional kind of danger, like sort of forms, but done in this kind of beautiful kind of way. I just think it's incredibly effective, so I agree. And then this one I really enjoyed because it also looks back at the history as well as sort of brings forward, and I really think that's really important. And also just the simplicity of this image is just radiant. And
To go back to Joseph No Two Horns, to show like what, his classic Thunderbird style was. And he would like sort of draw this on shields and on drums. And that was his Thunderbird that sort of like, brought that energy down. I love it. And it's radiating. And then you can tell that like, is that the earth? Is that a sun? Like all the little like diamond patterning that's on top of it, they're not perfect. It's like that, if that was either a lithostone or it was like a ruby lith screen that was cut by hand, like it's not about perfection. It's about that every single one is different. It could be a radiation, it could be a person, it could be, an individual. And then I also love that it's just all of that energy is coming off of the Thunderbird. He's just soaring in the sky. Everything about this to me radiates literal joy. And you also have like the lines that are coming off of him. So it's like you are looking back, but then you're bringing that from, let's say, a drum or a shield, and you're bringing it into a poster form, and then you're also enframing it, and then you're also doing a hand quote of the Sioux sort of like poem down there. So it's just, I don't know, I'm getting everything I want out of this piece.
so I'm just going to mention for people who may not know. So Joseph No Two Horns was an influential artist who lived in the Standing Rock Reservation in the late 1890s. So that's the reference in terms of the actual imagery being used. Now, do you think that there's a lot of artists looking back like that? Because we haven't been talking a lot about artists sort of using these kind of quoting other artists in these posters. Is that something that is less common in your experience?
Oh, I think it's still around. Most
It's,
certainly. Like Stephen Paul Judd in my first article about reservation dogs. I love a good let's bring it back to the first conversation. He's literally taking an image, that has been used of having like that old indigeneity, and he's saying like, I used to, I was here before you were here, like take care of the land. Like they're looking back, but then also pulling it new, right? Because like Stephen Paul Judd is doing all of his work like Andy Warhol. He's using that sort of pop style. And so they're looking back and looking forward. So I love that you can kind of like get a both ways sort of duality here, and also make a reference back and then also say, cool, let's move forward, because you can't always get stuck in the back.
No, absolutely. Okay, so now let's tackle some of these questions. We have a couple of questions in our queue. So let's see. Um, Someone's asking, since there are hundreds of tribes, I guess the question here, I'm just going to tweak it a little bit. It's an anonymous question. Have you noticed that some groups created posters, others didn't? And I guess the question there, you've already mentioned about Mohawk. There seems to be a lot of production around the Mohawk community. But are there other communities that have really embraced this kind of graphic identity in ways that you think are notable?
There might be, but I don't know them all.
Got it.
And that's the thing. It's like when there are hundreds, I can try to find them. But I guess when I think about, again, what is saved in these archives, what is in these public libraries, what are in these university libraries that I can get to, I need both, right? Like I need the internet to tell me, but I also need to look at physicality so I can go hold it and see it and like flip through it and smell it. Like I need both. And so like I honestly like I don't know, which is why I'm like, hi, this is a really big topic. Can
I
other
want to tell
people
you.
help
Yep.
out and join? Right. It's like I can't, I can't just do this by myself right now. I mean, I know
Totally.
I'm not. Like there are
So,
so many more scholars out there, but like yeah, there's a lot to do.
so that this actually flows into the next question, which I guess you've already answered. So I'll just sort of say it and we can kind of move on. It says, how do you build a show on a topic where you don't know if there is a printed history yet, in terms of that? So I guess you're finding out, and this is the beauty of it. So, and then also someone just mentioned they love the idea of defining groups, not defining groups with a deficit model. So I don't know. That's great. Is there a story of Indigenous made posters in opposition to the Indian industrial schools like Carlisle? That's interesting.
Ooh, that I don't know. I'm gonna
Okay.
screenshot that one so I can
If
like look up
everyone
that
knows, just
myself
let
too.
us know.
Yeah.
Yeah, please. These are all good questions. How important is it to create this positive, forward-looking, hopeful vision? Someone's asking.
It's
Um,
very positive.
Yeah, no,
We
no. I
literally
guess how important they're asking how important it is. Like meaning like I guess it's sort of like what have you seen perhaps, or I guess this type of futurity, how people are responding to it perhaps.
uh they're joining in and helping. They're saying this is awesome. They're being congratulatory. Like, like I wrote these articles and I felt really vulnerable and every single person I talked to were like, we're really proud of you. This is really awesome. So I feel like we need more of that. We need more of the help
Absolutely.
and be like, yeah, I found this. I thought of you. Hey, I'm working on this. Hey, I worked on this poster. That's why it's like I hope when my show at Poster House actually opens that it can then travel, that then other people can see it in other states and like other places, and like other kids can say, "Oh, I can make posters like that. I can put my creativity into formulating that joy." That's what I want to happen, right? Like I want that sort of that joy to like be perpetual.
Absolutely. Then we have another question, I guess, about the publication, the Mohawk publication you mentioned, but I think I'll just share this so that people can find out for themselves. I just found this link so people can take a look and see. Find it. I will put it right here. But some information about the publication if anyone's interested. And then Angelina has logged on and she's asking, what's the most interesting poster you've discovered so far in your research? I love this. So,
Ooh. So
what
I
do you
mean,
think?
like I am not one of those people that has like a favorite child.
Yes.
I'm not gonna say like I just love finding new ones all the time. I will say there is one, and Angelina knows what it is. It's an Aqua Sansi Notes poster that I want
I
to
love that
use
you're
as
like, there isn't a favorite poster, but
but there is. I mean, oh, I will speak out of both sides of my mouth. Like, it's an Aquasanti Notes poster, and it's a statue of an indigenous person on a horse with a big spear or a staff. And on the top of it is a grocery cart that has been turned upside down, and it's just like it's been skewered. And so it's making sort of like a wonderful political commentary. And like that's one that when I saw that, I was just like, ooh, that says a lot without saying almost anything. And so I think that might be like one of the ones that I'm sort of like, I'll make you special. You go into my
I love
private
that.
collection. Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so now someone is asking, are there posters beyond activist posters within Indigenous communities, like even just advertising posters, event posters, this type of thing? I guess
Oh,
someone's asking
absolutely.
like that.
There are powwow posters. There are posters that there are calendars that have been made. I have some from War Bonnet Enterprises from the late 1960s as well, 1968, 1969, 72, and 73. And they're done by, they show the solar calendar around a circle, and then they have the moon signs and the different tribes and what they would call each moon sign on different pieces of paper. And they have their own visual language, colors, and those were made in like in the late 60s, early 70s. And so yeah, there are more posters. I'm using protests right now to sort of like literally make a stink and cause space to sort of like make my way in, but there are a lot of the normal day to day. There are HIV/AIDS activist posters from the late 80s to early 90s. Like there's a lot of other sort of life that's churning around that is very prevalent and still exists even to this day. I'm just looking at the ones that are a little broader, let's say, in a way.
Absolutely. And then Heather Lenz just mentioning about the Akwesasne Freedom School starting in the
I
70s and still teaching in the Mohawk language. So, and then
I
just wanted
wrote
to
yeah, I
say
wrote
that,
that down.
yes. And then someone else mentioned about the notes about the publication having international distribution, which is really kind of interesting. So, um, so that's good. That's also interesting. Then how do you find a healthy balance between the tough, unwhitewashed real history and joy? Ooh,
Well, I can answer
interesting.
that one.
Yes,
I
please.
cannot read Indigenous history after I have dinner. I would start to read a because like when my night quiets down, I've eaten dinner. If I'm not watching television, if it's a reading night, I was like, cool. I'm just gonna pick up one of my Indigenous books and keep reading. I can't do that. I have to handle hard topics before lunch because if I don't, I'll stew on it. I will go to bed in a very unhappy way. So you have to say, I feel comfortable enough to tangle this now, and then like come back with something joyful, like this is really awesome. I'm going to work on something that's going to help somebody else. You really do have to find that fine line because, I'll sing and I'll call to my ancestors and say, hey, help me with this, like be around, be present, like, you are speaking through me. And then the anger comes out and then the
Yeah,
sadness comes out and the grief comes out and then it literally will freeze me in my tracks.
yeah,
So I have to be very careful because like when I ask, of course it comes down, of course they're going to show up, they're literally in my DNA, they're listening to me, and then at the same time they're going to be like, cool, you want to cry for 4 hours? I'm like, no, not today, please. I
right.
would prefer that you give me some joy. So like you have to learn to set up those safety valves to handle this because that's why like handling those hard topics, they are really hard. Genocide is not easy, as we well know in today's day and age. So it's like you have to understand how to slowly approach this because we can't really blow up the whole house while we're inside of it.
Yeah. Well, and I think the one thing that I think people are only sort of taking more seriously is, when you're taught, when you study a topic that has a lot of trauma involved, sometimes it does have a real impact on your mood or something. So when you're looking at, perhaps imagery around a war or any type of kind of violence, it does have an impact on you as a researcher. So I'm glad you're taking that time. So thank you for doing that. And also thank you for this project. It's been so interesting. So now we have another question from Zena Compston, who says they're an Aboriginal woman from Australia, a Bakarji, and wanted to let your audience know that there's a fabulous exhibition of Australian Aboriginal printmakers at the Club Rue right now, curated by an Aboriginal woman, Jessica Hutchins, from a amazing donation of works created with community of over 40 years by Basil Hall Editions. Check it out. They aren't political posters, but incredible examples of our print movement here in Oz Aboriginal communities. So I'll just share that link for people who are interested. But yeah, good to know. Thank you, Zena, for showing up and letting us know. So now, when is your poster house exhibit? Someone is asking.
It opens in September of 2026. So we have
Okay.
time, but at the same time, we have no time. So I have a lot to do. And I'm hoping to also write a book and have the book come out at the same time as well. So I'm a little busy. But yes, it opens in September. I think it's September the 24th of 2026. And
So
it's open
now's
until
also the time
February the
to
6th. Yeah, to
Right. Then now's
plan
the
that.
time to send you tips if there's anything that people think you should include or take a look at, perhaps.
That's right.
Good time. So now someone's asking, Salvador Munoz, do you have a dream poster or object that you're chasing for the exhibit? Oh, that's
I
a good
mean,
question.
yeah, I have
There
those.
must be.
I'm
Every curator has that object they want to encounter or they've heard of, but they don't know where it is, or no?
so like I know that there's one that I know that exists somewhere else that I know we have a contact that can get it for me. I
Okay.
think what I really want is I'm trying to also when you don't speak in a homogenized voice, and there's lots of things to talk about. I still need to find the actual physical posters of the HIV/AIDS stuff from the 80s. I need to physically find those and bring them in. I just found a work that I'm really happy about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. So it's a very contemporary image that I'm happy to come in. I'm not happy about it, but I'm happy that I found one that really sort of sings in a way that I'm trying to like form in. I think what I'm really looking for is a two-spirit piece, something that is purely queer. And it's like I have ideas around, but like queerness and two-spirit nature, though it's been around for millennia, is getting more traction and more visibility now. So to find those individuals that have made those posters, I think that's going to be like an early aughts sort of thing, or even of the now. So like I am looking for that because it's like I want there to be queerness, but then to add to that queerness, I would love there to be some kind of disability poster, like an Indigenous person that either is in a wheelchair or is like differently abled in terms of like vision or body motion or movement or just sort of like mental health. I really feel like I can't hit everything, but I feel like that's such an important topic that we really don't talk about enough. And so to be able to
Yeah.
find that, like health concerns, like alcoholism has been big in the tribal issues for a long time, as has diabetes, not having enough food, not having enough access to healthcare. So a healthcare twinge on it would be nice. I don't have any of those right now. So like I know what I need? Yes, I know exactly what I need. And so I'm trying to get those pieces. So yeah, if anybody
So is
knows,
everyone
please reach
listening?
out.
Yeah, everyone listening, please find those posters. Let your friends know. Someone's on the hunt for those because those seem like they'd be an important addition for that show. So wonderful. So now AX has this wonderful question. I wish I asked this initially, saying after having done this collection of posters, are there any new keys to decolonizing design that you would add to Dory Tunstall's list? Ooh, that's a good one.
As of right now, I would say no, because in all honesty, I want the land back. I just want to talk about these hard truths and I want to promote joy. Like there might be more, and maybe that's for the generation behind me or the generation behind them to start adding to this. But for right now, I only have two hands and I can count to five on one of them. And in all honesty, like there's so much to do. Like if they exist, I'm kind of not looking for them,
Got
or
it.
I would like to see maybe a more cohesive set to then see how that starts to work there. And then I feel like a collective of other Indigenous scholars should also look at it together. And I want that to happen too, to be like, are there things and motifs and ideas that are rising up that could be a very Indigenous capital I design thread that really does run through all of the different tribes and languages that says like these are things that, and not only for Turtle Island, but let's say Aotearoa or like South America or any other sort of like area that truly has like a deep indigenous people, the Australia, just stuff like that, where it's like, no, these are key notes that are sort of singing above that we can sort of see and listen to.
Absolutely. Okay, one final question from an anonymous attendee. Can you speak to the inter-Indigenous collaborations with regard to this project? For instance, collaborations between Indigenous Americans, Indigenous Brazilians. I guess the question is about like a broader, like, is this part of a sort of a global conversation? Is this part of an inter-Indigenous conversation? What do you
It
find?
is, and it's coming up, and like I feel like there's a great book called Indigenous Histories that it just came out recently that I really love that also deals with and I will turn my background off and now you can see like my messy office. But like this is sort of like what I love about it because it really is dealing with different land masses. It is dealing with South America. It's dealing with Central America. It's dealing with parts of Africa and Australia. And I feel like that is going on now. I had to limit myself to say I grew up in the mid-Atlantic region of what is now the United States. I cannot speak for all indigeneity writ large. And so I had to give myself a focusing point, or I would probably start to just break down because my body frame cannot handle all that. And so, like, is it a thing to talk about now? Of course it is. And I also feel like it's mirroring what happened like in the civil rights movement, that you had the moving of the Black Panthers with the American Indian movement, and then you had the murder of George Floyd, you had everything happening at sort of Standing Rock. And again, these waves are cresting and traveling together, and I'm seeing these patterns that are happening, and I'm
Right.
noticing many, many similarities across the board. So I feel like there are like it is a topic that's coming up now, and I'm hoping that everyone that showed up because of that. They see the need and they want to enjoy and join in on the conversation.
Absolutely. Do you have about 10 or 15 more minutes? We can just sort of continue the conversation. Is that
Sure
okay?
do. Yeah,
Awesome.
totally.
Okay. So now, curating posters, are there any unique things that people should know about when it comes to posters? I mean, I assume that, like, in terms of display, in terms of, is there anything about the history of posters or even like archives you're using that you think people would be interested to know?
I feel like Angelina should get up here and talk about like what are things like when you say like what is a poster? Because I also then start to pick a fight. Well, a poster is supposed to be something that is made to then be shown and displayed in public, right? But when the indigenous people took over Alcatraz, they literally stretched a hide and did their proclamation to the Great White Father, and that was displayed in public on a stretched piece of hide. Is that a poster? I think it's a poster. A lot of poster like artisans and creators and museums would say that's not a poster. So what are we looking for? Like it needs to be shown in public, it needs to be displayed, it needs to have a message, even if that message is just joy, indigeneity, or design. Is it trying to sell something? Is it trying to market an opera? There's so many things that are going on there where I feel like what can they start looking for? Like a broadsheet is not necessarily a poster that's used like behind glass or a marquee or the big subway posters that were made by the New Red Order. I think poster is really, really broad. And it's also like an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper printed at home, and you pin that up in a local coffee shop. That could be a poster too. Does it have to be 24 by 36? Because the industrial complex tells you that's a poster frame that you can buy at a
Right.
store, and so that's a poster size. Like there's lots of things, and I see that Angelina's comment, like she's commenting
Yes.
here, like
Yes, and
a
I'll just
poster is
mention
a
it because Angelina,
please do,
yeah,
yeah.
because Angelina just sort of chimed in. And those of you who don't know Angelina, she's a curator also of posters, and she was a former recipient of the Emily Hall Tremaine journalism fellowship for curators. And her explanation here is a poster is a public facing notice meant to persuade that marries word and image. So Angelina's saying maybe that thing on Alcatraz actually does qualify, right? So
And then
I
you
always
have to
thought of it
wonder, like,
as an object that had a multiple. So I always thought of it that way. But I guess perhaps that's old thinking.
but I mean, it that way of thinking, at least to me, is also based on a socioeconomic availability. Do you have the capital to replicate this so you can go put it up a lot of places and skew something in your favor, or have someone vote for you, or have someone buy your object, or like right, like there's a level of capitalism extraction that comes along with some of that, and so it
But then,
gets
but
it
then,
gets a
how is it
little.
different than a painting? I guess that's where the question, right? It's like if it's a unique object, then it can also be a painting. Like in the case of that Alcatraz thing, I mean, that could also be considered a painting, I'm guessing.
Well, but so this is funny because the Johnny Daikon stomp dance, he actually painted that poster and then he had it photographed and replicated. So I feel like the replication aspect does have to come into that, but then some of that replication, what's the difference between a poster and a print? And then it becomes a whole fight of semiotics. And it's like
Right.
I don't really know if I want to get into a semiotics fight because the fight for me is like I'm looking for Indigenous join to talk about hard topics. I really don't want to have to sit here and codify and codify things over and over and over and over and over again just to make someone happy about it. I'm like, y'all can have that fight somewhere else. I'm just trying to look at these 5 decolonization points.
Got it. Well, it's also interesting to mention because some of those images were designed to be shared online, but that's a form of multiplication and printing as well, right? In terms of memes and sort of publishing things on your own account. And so, I mean, what the multiplicity there is a different question, of course, as well. So,
And that has been a conversation that I've had with also like younger generations that have turned to me and say, Brian, you're asking us to print something that is a boundary and a barrier that for some individuals that are so already dealing with the issue of reservation life, genocide, like being marginalized, how can you expect me to print something? I mean, printer ink is expensive. For color ink is expensive. To be able to design something digitally, to put it on social media and then to promote something, and then like you said, like it becomes a multiple of, I mean, that is a multiplication in a way.
Right.
But for me and for all of my friends that know me, my archivist brain goes, how do we archive that? Because that's also being held on someone else's server. What is actually fueling that server? What are the
That's
social and like what are the environmental
that's a
impacts
good
of that
question.
server? It
So
it gets really wonky.
how do you archive digital images as a curator? Like what are you looking for? Let's say I'm a creator. I want to create this image. I've done it, and you're like, wow, that's great. I want to share. Like, do you go back to the person and say, I'd like the highest resolution file you have? I'd like the one you post.
I
Like,
mean,
what is it that you
that's
say?
that's exactly what I did, and so the you are on blank land. That
Yeah.
PDF was released by the Arts and Cultures Department. That PDF is made to be a digitally accessible image that you can print at home, right? And so for me, I am going to print that out. I'm going to write Lenape or Light Monacan, and I'm going to be like, cool, this is my poster for the show. And that to me is I have that file. I had to ask Sadie for her file. I was like, I need that file, Sadie. Can you find any of the originals that were printed? She's like, I'll do my best. Here, do you want the file? And she sent me the raw file. So
Hmm.
it becomes this, what is a level of gatekeeping? What is a level of true archivist nature? But then when do those also become barriers and when do they become bridges, right? Like, and so it's how do we then reconceptualize how has, mm, I don't want to say capitalism because again, it's a broad stroke, but like when are these ideas of extraction and gatekeeping and power that are based on white supremacy also keeping out other modes of fluid dialogue? And I think that's what is sort of starting to come up for me.
Got it. So now, when you're looking at these images and you're trying to do you categorize them in certain ways, like for yourself, or do they tend to be by the like? Are there certain categories that you yourself have for images around native graphic imagery? Because we all keep buckets in our head. Go, oh, those tend to be this kind of image. Are there any that you'd love to share or open to share?
I just have, I also want to make sure when I'm picking something out that I'm looking at does it also who are the most harmed, right? It comes back to that. Like, can I find works that are using indigenous language when you have a huge propensity of indigenous languages that are dying?
Yeah.
I would rather say language based. Like what are like is it Osage? Is it Cherokee? Is it a culmination of Cherokee and English? Like I would want to support that. Like does it actually support the culture of that indigenous tribe? Like is it really sort of trying to say we are still here, we are still making this? I feel like that's kind of how I'm trying to really sort of navigate that is like when is it uplifting, like when is it culturally supporting. I mean, I literally am leaning into like the things that Dory said because I'm like if these are the things that also will decolonize it, because if you open up Megs right now in that sixth edition, cool, how many indigenous works do you see in designed by indigenous people that are not advertisements for a crying faux indigenous man saying please don't throw those things away? Like that's not real. So if we haven't been
That's
allowed
the
to be,
infamous image for those people who don't know of a non-indigenous person that would sort of frankly cosplay as indigenous. I don't know what to call it, but was featured on a number of national advertisements for littering and preserving the environment. Just sorry,
which
just giving
were
context for
also
people.
paid for by the plastics corporations, but that's a whole nother sort of like
Right.
deeper nastiness that you can know. But like it's things like that. It's like when you're just trying to give yourself a space at the table and say, please pay attention, at least if it's because I get really afraid of going towards old tropes that I was taught in college. Like, this is what makes good design because it has a positive and negative space. It creates tension. Like, well, what about those things already existed sort of in indigeneity, which is why for me, I have to go to museums to see prayer rugs, the pottery, the baskets. I want to go to different communities in sort of like Aotearoa, New Zealand, or I want to go to Australia, or I'm going to go somewhere else into Canada and really look at what are those craft forms still telling me that it's just as important as the fine art that are the paintings on the wall, right? Because like, what is that making? How was that textile made? Like, what are you trying to say by the actual blanket that is telling me a story? Not only is it telling me a story, I can wrap it around me and it physically keeps me warm. So the metaphor also protects me at the same time. Like we've sort of, I feel like in the Western gaze have removed some of that. And so when I'm trying to find these pieces, it's like, when is it showing me something that I might not have necessarily learned in my art education at the moment that I was going to school in the very early aughts? Like that's kind of like I'm trying to make sure that, I come from like, it's like I'm not 100% indigenous. It's like I'm a nice split. And so it's like I have to meld both of these worlds together. And so how do I know when one world of academia is overpowering my indigenous side and to really think about that?
Yeah, it's powerful. And now you're also a creator. You also a designer yourself. I'd love to for you to talk a little bit about the design you look at, or the designers that maybe influence your own work as someone who's part of the community and also creating design.
I love Polymode. I love the creative like studios family that I have made with Silas Monroe, and Rinda Hadi and Michelle Lamb and Edgar Cesarin and like everyone that has joined in, like Audrey, our studio manager. Like, what do I look at? With the team, we really think about how our intuition can actually lead us to do things. I want to look at something because something in my body goes, that's really awesome, or that's going to teach me something new. It's what am I drawn to? Like, where do my passions go? Like, I always got mad when someone in school would say, that's interesting. And I would get really, really like sort of like agitated by that. I was like, no, is it interesting because you would go buy a book on it and you would read more about it? To me, it's like if I do want to learn something and I'm drawn towards it, that magnetism is sort of like what I want to gravitate towards. And so if we like can uplift a marginalized voice and make more spaces for these individuals that have been left out of the design canon, the art canon, and our world as it stands right now, I want to do things like that. So I'm looking in that direction with my small little lantern, like the rest of us, trying to find our way. And that's what I feel like I'm looking at.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Brian. This was great. And I just want to say thank you so much for, taking the leap of faith on this project, because I know there's a lot of unknowns and you've been doing a great job of sort of starting that conversation and also sort of allowing people to sort of listen in on this kind of conversation you're developing. And also coming from a place of not just curator or creator, but also someone who's really sort of passionate about this. So, and people can check out your show in 2026 in September. So that's wonderful to keep in mind. And this was the final talk in our Emily Hall Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators. And Brian, thank you so much for being part of this and all the work you do. And I just want to thank you everyone for attending and really looking forward to the conversations that come out of this. Because I'm sure people will be contacting you. And if anyone needs to contact Brian, they're welcome to email us and we'll forward the message. So hopefully you'll be able to find the Two Spirit and all the other posters you're looking for as well.
That would be great. And thanks all for coming, for listening. Thank your ancestors for coming. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody.